Russia is going to collapse, and it's time we start preparing for it. Ever since Russia's attempt to take Kyiv and install a puppet government failed in the early days of the war, a defeat for the Kremlin in Ukraine has looked increasingly likely. But what's stunning, after almost a year of the war, there is near total absence of any discussion among politicians, policymakers, analysts, and journalists, or the general mainstream media of what this means. In fact, the only area that has seen any real discussion is what Ukraine's victory means for the West, and this tunnel vision is extremely dangerous. The consequences of defeat for Russia don't only stop at its borders. Instead, this collapse could set the world down a very, very dark path. One that, if we're not careful, soon enough we won't be able to stop from happening. So together, let's be the first to truly evaluate what a Russian collapse will look like. And by the end of this video, I will not only tell you the extremely dangerous situation it puts the world in, but hopefully how we can prevent it. There's a reason that Russia invaded Ukraine, and it's not any of the reasons that you've heard. As Russia spent much of 2021 amassing troops on its Ukrainian border, an important headline almost escaped notice. While Russian President Vladimir Putin threatened Ukraine, Russia suffered its largest natural population decline since World War II, losing nearly 1 million people in the year-long period between October 2020 and September 2021. Although COVID-19 casualties in Russia were severe, and probably highly underreported, this wasn't the problem. You see, instead, it was the opening shot of a longer-term trend that will manifest itself over the next decade. Russia is about to enter a prolonged and painful period of demographic decline at home. But to understand this population decline, we need to go back in time a little bit. You see, the roots of this demographic decline rest in the 1990s, and the chaos that was brought on by Russia's post-Soviet transition from essentially planned economy to a capitalist, market-based one. The transition was characterized by economic turmoil, mass unemployment, and alcoholism, all of which combined to briefly give Russia one of the world's lowest male life expectancies. The most lasting impact, however, was a concurrent collapse in birth rates. From 1993 to 2007, the fertility rate, defined by the number of children a woman can be expected to have over the course of her lifetime, fell below 1.5. Far below the 2.1 replacement rate needed to hold a population steady. And now, for the first time, the effects of this dramatic and prolonged collapse in birth rates are now becoming apparent. A brief glance at Russia's population illustrates how this effect is taking hold. There are around 12.5 million Russians between the ages of 30 and 34 who were born around or just before the collapse of the Soviet Union. In contrast, there are around 6.5 million people between the ages of 20 and 24 who were born during the chaos of the late 1990s. What this signifies is a smaller base of people able to bear children, which means birth rates is almost destined to continue to decline. And that is exactly what has happened. After a brief period of natural population growth in the mid-2010s, Russia's population once again began to contract in 2019. And it will continue to do so well into the foreseeable future. And this bleak reality became even more dire with the arrival of COVID-19. The Kremlin's initial dismissal of COVID-19 and efforts to spread vaccine disinformation across the West appear to have backfired on its own population, resulting in a vaccination rate that ranks as one of the lowest in the developed world. Low vaccination uptake, coupled with a laissez-faire approach to COVID-19 and a weak healthcare system, have contributed to one of the world's highest COVID-19 fatality rates. Russian government counts around 300,000 deaths, but a more reliable estimate from The Economist put the figure near 1 million, meaning Russia has the distinction of having the most COVID-19 deaths per capita than any other country except Bulgaria. As stated, COVID-19 wasn't the sole factor, but it set the population collapse into overdrive. This demographic reality is perhaps the greatest limiting factor for Putin's vision in Ukraine. However, this reality is also what forced Putin to invade Ukraine. Vladimir Putin spent years racing against Russia's demographic clock, only to order an invasion of Ukraine that's co-signing his country's population into a historic decline. But if your country has a population problem, why would you get into a war? Well, the reason being is that the consistent population decline, as well as the massive impact that coronavirus had, put Russia's population demographic on a path of no return. This meant that this was Putin's and the Kremlin's last realistic opportunity to invade Ukraine. Many believe that Russian intelligence was to blame for simply underestimating Ukraine's strength. And while this could be partially true, the reality is they had no choice but to invade. Let's look at a crude metric, the militarization rate. This is a ratio comparing the number of men aged 20 to 34 with the size of the military. This would allow Russian demographics challenges to be put into context. In 2020, Russia's militarization rate was 6.31%, based on 14.25 million men aged 20 to 34 in the country and a standing military of 900,000. Looking at the projection of the decline of Russian men aged 20 through 34 by 2030, to maintain a military of 900,000, Russia would have to increase its militarization rate to 7.79% in 2025 and 8.1% in 2030. Doesn't sound like a big deal? Well, let's compare to some other countries and see just how militarized Russian society already is. Here are the 2020 militarization rates for other powers. The United States, 3.86%, France, 3.62%, Turkey, 3.58%, Italy, 3.52%, and so on and so on. Russia is more than 2 times more militarized than any other world superpower. Now let's compare to their neighbors. Ukraine's 2020 militarization rate was 4.82%, Romania's was 3.8%, and Poland's was 3.16%. If there is such a thing as a hypothetical maximum militarization rate that a society can bear, Russia is by far the closest major power to reaching it, meaning its capacity to increase recruitment over the medium term is severely limited when it's compared to its peers. And the invasion of Ukraine only made this far, far worse. With military operations likely to continue in the coming months, Russia may see less than 1.2 million births next year, the lowest in modern history. To put it simply, a demographic reckoning has arrived for Russia. Its economy starved of young employees and now at risk of stagnation or worse long after the war is over. Bloomberg Economics now estimates Russia's potential growth rate at 0.5%, down 2 percentage points from before the war, with demographics accounting for about a quarter of the downgrade. To put it simply, because of the declining population accelerated by the invasion of Ukraine and economic sanctions and stagnation, there is no return for Russia, at least the country we know today. Whether this will be good or bad for the West is an outcome policymakers should prepare for. There are various scenarios for what might happen in Russia after a defeat in Ukraine. Most likely is Russian President Vladimir Putin's departure from office, followed by a vicious power struggle among the extreme right-wing nationalists who want to continue the war effort and destroy the existing political hierarchy, authoritarian conservatives who have a stake in the system, and a resurgent semi-democratic movement committed to ending the war and reforming Russia. To predict who will win is nearly impossible, but we can confidently predict that the power struggle will weaken the regime and distract Russia from what remains of the war effort. However, what we can predict is that a weakened regime, in conjunction with a malfunctioning economy, will invite disgruntled Russians to take to the streets, perhaps even with arms, and encourage some of the non-Russian political units compromising the Russian Federation to opt for greater self-rule. Leading candidates like Chechnya and Dagestan, for example. If Russia can somehow survive this turmoil, it's likely to become a weak client state of China. If it does not, the map of Eurasia could look very different. The harsh reality, however, is that we can only observe the unfolding drama of Russia's likely collapse. Neither Western policies nor Putin himself can do much to stem it. That's because of all the deeply rooted institutional crises that we've been discussing. That doesn't mean that the West should just sit back as Russia degrades, though. In fact, it's imperative that we prepare for the collapse. Worst case scenarios should inform policymakers as they hope for the best, expect the worst, keep cool heads, and prepare for contingencies. But we also need to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, such as trying to help a clearly dying Soviet Union survive and prioritizing the needs of Russia over those of its neighbors. The countries along Russia's border, from the Baltic states to Central Asia, will, if they manage to remain stable, be key to containing whatever instability takes place within Russia. They will also be key in helping the Russian Federation's newly independent successor states stabilize and behave with moderation. Seen in this light, continued strong Western support for Ukraine, and eventually for a free Belarus, and key countries like Kazakhstan is the best guarantee that the aftershocks will be minimized when Russia collapses. If you guys enjoyed that video, please do me a huge favor and like the video, as well as subscribe for updates, as well as polls on the next video topic. See you guys in the next one.